どこに行っても所在がなくて、一層自分のことを知ってる人が一人もいない中で暮らしてみたいって思ったことはないですか？
Moving to a new country can feel like starting over, a fresh page. But what if that chapter isn't what you expected? People often ask me if moving to Japan is the right choice for them, and of course there's no universal answer since everybody's situation is different. But after almost 8 years of living here, I've seen many people move here full of excitement, only to leave disillusioned a few years later. So why does this happen? And more importantly, how can you avoid it? If you're considering moving to Japan, or you recently moved here, I hope this video helps you. I do want to be upfront though that while I have been living here for quite a few years, I still am learning myself. I don't have all the answers, just my own experiences, observations, and the lessons that I've picked up along the way. With that in mind, this isn't going to be a simple list of the pros and cons of living in Japan, or a breakdown of culture shock or adjusting to life in Japan. Instead, I want to dig a little bit deeper into some of the things that people don't necessarily think about when making such a big decision. The things that don't seem important at first, but end up shaping your entire experience. And along the way, I'll share what I got right, what I got wrong, and what I wish I had considered before making the move. So this might seem like a simple question, but I think the answer is more important than most people realize. Everyone will have their own reasons for wanting to pack up their lives and move overseas to somewhere like Japan. Maybe you've had a long-standing interest in the culture since childhood, or maybe you visited several times and felt a deep connection. Or maybe you're just looking for something different. But from my own observations over the years, having met and spent time with a lot of foreign residents, I've noticed an interesting trend. The people that struggle the most to adapt, the ones who find living here isn't quite what they imagined, often leave within their first 2 years, and more often than not, they're the ones who have the strongest reasons to move here in the first place. I think the reason for this is that the stronger the expectation and the longer you've had it, the more you build up an idea of what life here will be like, the harder the reality hits when you make the move. Now, I'm not saying that if you feel like you've got some deep connection to Japan, or you've visited 10 times, or have a long-standing interest in the culture, that you shouldn't move here. I think they're all perfectly valid reasons. I'm just saying that you should tone your expectations and remain flexible to the idea that things may not be what you expect. Not necessarily worse, just different. I think a big part of why I'm still here is that I arrived with a completely blank slate, absolutely no expectations, and in a way, there was nothing that I could really be disappointed by. I think also there may be a subset of people whose primary motivation is because they are running away from something as opposed to running towards something. Whether this is issues they have with their own country or the situation they find themselves in and are looking for some form of escape. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with this, but it's worth remembering that while moving to a different environment can feel like a fresh start, that feeling doesn't last forever. Eventually, the problems that you tried to leave behind may start to catch up with you. I've been through some of my most difficult times living in Japan, whether that's loneliness, anxiety, or uncertainty about the future. Our problems tend to have a habit of following us no matter where we go, and some things can't be left behind. Looking back, I wish I'd realized sooner that moving overseas wouldn't fix my problems, it just highlighted them in a different way. Ultimately, thinking about your reason for moving here is important. Not just having one, but truly understanding it, because at some point, reality will set in. For some, it happens immediately. For others, it creeps in slowly over months or years. But when that moment comes, the way you respond to it will determine whether Japan becomes your home or just another stop along the way. And even if your reasons for moving here are solid, will you be able to truly live here or just exist? Visiting Japan is not the same as living here, no matter how many times you visit. But it's possible to live in Japan without ever truly being a part of it. If I could go back in time and give myself a single piece of advice, it would be to take studying Japanese a lot more seriously. Living in Japan without being able to speak at least a daily conversational level of Japanese creates a kind of glass box effect, where there's always a layer of separation between you and the world that you're living in. It's like you're living in Japan, but you're not really living. As my decision to move to Japan was pretty sporadic, and I basically knew nothing about Japan before moving here, I didn't spend any time learning Japanese beforehand, meaning I could barely even introduce myself when I arrived. I can't even tell you how hard it is to try and live in a country where not only you can't speak to the people about even the most basic of things, but you also can't read anything or understand the world around you. But it goes way beyond that. Japanese as a language is deeply embedded into the culture itself. The way that you speak depends entirely on who you're speaking to and the situation that you're in. Being able to read the room and speak in an indirect manner is just as important as what you're saying. If you can't understand the language, you're never going to understand the culture either, nor be able to participate in it. This itself is one of the single biggest reasons that causes people to leave Japan, because they struggle with the language and therefore every aspect of their lives. So if you're planning to live here, then studying Japanese should really be your priority. After all, if you are to move somewhere, you have a responsibility to adapt to the local culture and integrate. If you can't speak the language, you'll never be able to do that. Not studying earlier is one of my biggest regrets, not only because I wasn't able to speak the language for my first few years, but because it kept me detached from the culture for so long. I remember so many moments where I felt like I couldn't participate in conversations or make any meaningful connections. Or times when doctors would explain things to me that I couldn't understand, or when mail came through my door that I couldn't read. I remember so many moments when I felt excluded from everything around me, disconnected from the people and the culture. At one point, I became so used to it, I would nod along, pretending to understand, just accepting that I was missing out on the world around me. In contrast to more recent times, I now know that I'm able to go anywhere and do anything, knowing that language isn't necessarily going to be an issue. I can chat with people and have better interactions and just generally understand the world around me better. And it wasn't until I got to this point that I really understood how much I was missing in the first few years. Not only that, but our language itself actually defines how we think. There's a great quote which is, "The limits of my language are the limits of my world," and I definitely think that it's true. The language that we speak constrains the kinds of thoughts that we have and therefore the experiences that we can engage in. When you learn a language such as Japanese, you will literally learn to think in different ways that you never had. And it's at this point that you can truly understand the culture and why people do the things that they do here. So if you're planning on making Japan your home, it's better to start studying as early as possible, because learning Japanese is really the key to truly living here as opposed to just existing here. But even after learning the language, it's still easy to fall into a bubble. If you're not consciously making an effort to interact with people or go out of your comfort zone, you might find that language alone isn't enough. Culture, habits, and unspoken social norms can still make you feel like an outsider if you're not actively engaging with them. Let's say you've spent a lot of time planning your move to Japan, figuring out how you'll get here and what you'll do once you arrive. Maybe you've just moved here, but what happens when the dust settles? At first, everything is new. The excitement of starting fresh in a new country can carry you for a while, but eventually the novelty wears off. Life finds its rhythm again as you fall into routine. The big goal you've worked so hard for, you've accomplished it. What happens next? Many people pour their energy into moving here and the logistics of getting settled that they forget to think longer term. I was an English teacher during my first couple of years here, and despite the challenges, it was one of the best experiences of my life so far. I was 21, fresh out of university, and I suddenly found myself in a completely different world. Interacting with students from a culture so different from my own really shifted my own perspective. It was eye-opening to see firsthand how Japanese values are embedded in daily life. Watching the students clean their school every day, serve their own lunches, and look out for each other with a sense of shared responsibility. It wasn't just about teaching English. It was about understanding a way of life I have never experienced before. In hindsight, I was probably learning more from them than they were from me. However, I never really saw English teaching as a long-term career. I'm not knocking it though. Many people do find a very fulfilling career out of teaching long-term and manage to find better financial opportunities, but for the vast majority, that's just simply not the case. Many others come to Japan through different routes, be it in tech, hospitality, marriage, or other means. Even then, they face similar long-term planning challenges. You might have come to Japan under comfortable circumstances, but things can change unexpectedly, and being unprepared may leave you without an opportunity to adapt. I only really planned to stay in Japan for about 6 months to a year, but fast forward the clock and here I am almost 8 years later. I know many people that have planned to come here for just a year or two, but before they know it, many years have passed. It's easy to get into the cycle of kicking the can down the road, telling yourself that you'll sort all of these things out later. But long-term thinking matters, and this is the advice I wish I could have given myself much earlier. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Do you have a plan beyond just living here? And if you do want to leave Japan one day, what will that look like? The absolute worst situation I can imagine is moving here to teach or take on some other low-skilled job because you want to experience Japan. Then a decade passes and you haven't achieved any significant career or personal growth. You decide to leave and you realize that you've spent all of those years without much to show for it. Again, I want to re-emphasize that I'm not knocking English teaching or any other job for that matter, and I'm not saying that you need to have your entire future planned out either. Of course, we can't predict the future, but it's very easy to keep pushing things off, assuming that you'll just figure it out someday. I've known people in this situation, and unfortunately, they've struggled to find work when moving back to their home countries too. If you plan to switch jobs after moving here, start taking steps early, whether that's studying Japanese, earning professional certifications, or just getting a feel for the job market. Try to find the balance. Don't overthink it, but don't ignore it either. Having a general plan can help to ground you. Japan can be an incredible chapter of your life, but without intention, it might become the whole story before you even realize it. So you might come to Japan for one reason, but if you stay, it'll likely be for another. The reasons you came here for may not be the ones that keep you here, and while you might love Japan, staying anywhere long-term comes with sacrifices, whether it's distance from family, career ceilings, or losing touch with your own native culture. One thing is inevitable. Moving to Japan will fundamentally change you. It will change how you see the world and how you see yourself. But the real question that people forget to ask is not why you want to move, but what will make you stay. Many people hit a turning point about a year or two in where the initial euphoria starts to fade and they start to heavily focus on the negative aspects of living in Japan. I myself am guilty of this too. It's natural. The initial excitement fades and you finally come to terms with the fact that you are actually living here and you're not on some kind of extended vacation. You fall into routine and small frustrations, bureaucracy, strict rules, the difficulty of forming deep relationships, the challenging work culture. Even something as minor as struggling to find the right cooking ingredients can start to feel overwhelming. This is a normal phase of culture shock. However, many people at this point may feel overwhelmed and decide to leave Japan. If you push through it though, you'll start to see things through a different lens. Not with the same initial euphoria you arrived with, but with a more mature and realistic perspective. You realize that no matter where you live, there will always be problems, but what's important is how you respond to them. For some people, sure, the negatives may outweigh the positives of living here, but for others, the positives may far outweigh the negatives. For me at least, the sense of safety, the low cost of living, the accessible healthcare, the order and cleanliness are things that, when I take a step back, I realize are rare luxuries in much of the world. With that being said, as the years go by, I do have to keep asking myself if I want to continue living here, and when I answer that question, I have to make sure that I answer it neutrally and not emotionally. Living in Japan has made me appreciate my own country, the UK, more than I ever did, and I now find myself in a place where I see both countries for what they are, both the good and the bad. And something I've come to realize is that it's not necessarily the place that makes the difference, it's the people that you're with. Nothing is ever black and white, and what we want now, we may not want in the future. None of us will be the same person in 5 years from now, and that's okay. And even for those who do have a long-standing interest in the culture, maybe one day you'll fall out of love with Japan as your priorities shift. Ultimately, my advice here would be that if you do have an interest in moving to Japan, don't let it just sit as a thought. Why not start taking the steps to turn it into a reality? We only get one shot at living life, and it's the opportunities that we don't take that we regret. But at the same time, preparation is important. Have a plan, understand where you are in life, understand that what you want may change, and be ready to adapt along the way. Japan will change you in ways you can't fully predict, and that's all part of the experience. Thanks for watching. Until next time.